Welcome to the Oxygen360 program. Encore Healthcare has really been focused on how do we bring outcomes and clinical management programs to the DME industry in a way that it really benefits the patient, but also the DME. We can bring value to your patients and value to the business at the same time, and we're doing it through clinical outcomes programs. And so Oxygen360 is really a model that we developed a couple of years ago with a focus on how do we improve management of oxygen patients in the home. And as we know, over the years, oxygen reimbursement has been cut drastically. And so with the oxygen cuts, what we've seen is that it's been harder and harder for companies like yours to be able to provide care for oxygen patients, meaning that you do the setup, you take them the equipment, but then to go beyond that, have a respiratory therapist involved or do any kind of follow-up has almost become impossible because the rate that you get paid for oxygen as a company is very low. And so today, there's not a lot of management that happens for oxygen patients. So we're going to talk about how Encore Healthcare has developed a model that allows for the remote care of oxygen patients to identify gaps in care, identify needs that those patients have, and really bring benefit to you as a sales rep to be able to go back and have a valuable conversation with the physician around how the patient's doing and any changes in their status. So for instance, if they start to struggle with something, or if they start to have issues with secretion clearance or ventilation or need a different medication, then that's the type of information that we're collecting and we're presenting back to you so that you can go have that conversation with the physician. So if you think about kind of the sales process, traditionally, you've been going out talking to physicians, talking to case managers about your service, and really the only way to beat the competition has been I've got better service than the next guy, or better response time, those types of things, or you've got better relationships, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But today with this model, it really brings clinical value back to the physician community, back to the providers, to show them, hey, I've got a story to tell about a patient that we're managing together. Because if it's your oxygen patient already, traditionally, like I said, we're not engaging with them a whole lot as DMEs, but with this model, we're starting to engage with them. Every patient gets a respiratory navigator assigned to them, and that navigator is going to help manage their care alongside of you. And so the way that works is that we are an extension of your DME. We're an extension of your service. And so what we're doing is when we contact the patient, we represent ourselves as your team. The caller ID shows up as your team. And so everything that we do is coming from your organization. It's not from Encore, but we're an extension of your service. And when we engage a patient, we're representing ourselves that way. So I want to walk you through kind of the genesis of where this program came from. We looked at, did an internal study as Encore. We looked at 10,000 oxygen patients and about 1,000 ventilator patients. And what we found was we tried to figure out what happened between the time they were on oxygen until the time they ended up on ventilation or airway clearance. And what we found was very interesting. And that is that along the way, there were certain things that happened, or indicators that happened, that triggered us that patient needed to be on therapy, advanced therapies like ventilation or airway clearance, much earlier in the process. But what we also found was between the time they got put on oxygen to the time that they received ventilation or airway clearance, there was very minimal interaction from the DME because of those reasons I just talked about, that the reimbursement's been cut so much. And so in that time frame, we kind of looked back and said, what happened between oxygen and ventilation? The average time was about 18 months that it took a patient to go from getting prescribed oxygen for the first time to getting prescribed ventilation or airway clearance for the first time. But along the way, as you see on the screen here, there were things that happened that indicated that patient needed to be on that therapy much earlier in the process. We started to see symptoms show up that indicated that they needed airway clearance or needed ventilation, needed another therapy. Then we started to see hospitalizations show up. And oftentimes when we think about ventilator patients or airway clearance patients, they go to the hospital over and over and over again for the same reason. And because of that, we really are failing them as a healthcare system, as a healthcare team, because they're continuing to have the same problem and it's not being addressed in the home. And by the way, this is your oxygen patient, and they need a service that you offer. And so the challenge here is, how do we identify those patients earlier in the process when they first have symptoms, when they first start to show indications that they need that therapy, and then get in front of the physician and show them, hey, this patient's trending in that direction. So what do you think about getting them on therapy? So the whole goal of this program is, when we're managing patients, we're looking for gaps in care so that we can present them back to you, and you can go present them to the physician. So it gives you a valuable tool in your toolbox to go have a conversation with the doc, a clinical conversation with the doc. And if you're thinking, well, I'm not clinical, well, that's okay. You don't have to be clinical to have this conversation. We've set the process up so that, clinical or not, you can take a few nuggets out of our reporting that we're going to show you and really go have an intelligent conversation with a physician. And if you think about it, when we think about respiratory patients, generally an oxygen patient is first a nebulizer patient. So nebulizer patients become oxygen patients. Oxygen patients become ventilator or airway clearance patients. So it's a funnel, if you will. And the problem or the challenge that we've had for years in this industry is we treat each one of those different devices as its own business line. The nebulizer business, the oxygen business, the ventilation business. But generally it's the same patient who's flowing through this process of, they get diagnosed, they get a nebulizer, they get inhalers, then they get on oxygen, and then eventually some patients, not all, but some, end up on advanced therapies. And so the challenge we've had historically is that we haven't really managed that funnel well. We've treated these as separate individuals, but it really is the same patient. So if you think about your current oxygen patients that you have on service, those are the patients who are going to be your future ventilator patients, or currently need those services now. And that's one of the things we find all the time, is that those patients that are on oxygen have needs that are going unmet. And if you look at the clinical data, the clinical studies and the clinical data out there tells us 20 to 30% of the oxygen population need to be are going to end up being on ventilation, and 20 to 30% are going to end up being on airway clearance, based on the number of patients who struggle with hypercapnia or struggle with secretion clearance issues or bronchiectasis. And so what we see in the industry, though, is that DME across the United States, if you look at the data from HME Data Bank or from the VGM data, what we see is that there's a very small percentage of those patients, it's 5% or less across the United States, who are oxygen patients who have advanced therapy. So there's this really big gap in the number of patients who need that therapy and who currently have that therapy. And which means that you have oxygen patients today, lots and lots of them, who need to be on advanced therapies, and those needs are not being met because, again, as a healthcare system, we've kind of failed that patient in allowing them to become reoccurring admissions or frequent flyers, going back to the hospital over and over for respiratory failure or for secretion issues and pneumonias, when those are the patients that we should have got on the therapy that we offer, that you offer, much earlier, and we could have avoided those hospitalizations from happening. So there's this big gap in who needs the therapy, who actually has the therapy. Oxygen360 starts to fill that gap and identify those gaps in care, identify those patients.